The people who change your life are rarely the ones you expect. Sometimes they are the ones you never bothered to see. Rain slid down the towering windows of the Alder house like silver threads, softening the skyline of Manhattan into blurred ribbons of light. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while conversations worth millions of dollars floated quietly beneath the music of a lone piano. It was the kind of restaurant where reservations disappeared months in advance and every table carried a story that could change a company, a career, or a fortune. Emily Carter moved gracefully between those stories wearing a neatly pressed white shirt, a black apron, and comfortable black shoes that had crossed the same dining room thousands of times. She remembered every regular's favorite coffee, every anniversary, every food allergy, and every guest who preferred silence over conversation. Most people believed she carried plates. Very few realized she carried memories. She greeted an elderly couple by name before placing warm sourdough bread on their table without being asked. She quietly replaced a cold espresso for another guest before he noticed the temperature had changed. She adjusted a chair for a little girl so naturally that even the child's mother never realized it had happened. Emily never searched for attention. She searched for details. At exactly 7:18 in the evening the atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted without anyone announcing it. The front doors opened. Ethan Brooks stepped inside surrounded not by bodyguards but by expectation. The billionaire chief executive officer of Brooks Capital rarely visited public restaurants unless an important negotiation demanded it. His charcoal suit fit with effortless precision. A platinum Swiss watch rested beneath the cuff of his tailored jacket. His expression carried the confidence of a man who had spent years making decisions measured in billions instead of thousands. Investors stood to greet him. The restaurant manager hurried forward personally. Staff members instinctively straightened their posture. Power had entered the room, and everyone felt it. Everyone except Emily. She simply picked up a fresh pot of coffee and continued working. Ethan settled into the private corner reserved for his meeting with board members and investment partners. Thick folders filled with financial projections rested beside crystal water glasses. Quiet greetings became serious discussions about acquisitions, quarterly forecasts, and international expansion. Emily approached the table carrying fresh coffee. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks," she said gently. "Would you like the dark roast you ordered during your last visit?" Ethan barely looked up from the documents spread before him. "Whatever is fastest." Emily nodded politely and poured the coffee without spilling a single drop. As she reached across the table, one loose page slid from the stack and drifted toward the floor. She caught it before it touched the marble. "Thank you," one executive said. Ethan accepted the page from her hand without meeting her eyes. "Please try not to interrupt the meeting next time." The table became silent. One executive looked uncomfortable. Another quietly stared into his coffee. Emily simply smiled. "Of course, sir." She placed the page exactly where it had been and walked away without defending herself. Behind the service station another waitress whispered, "That was not your fault." Emily folded a clean linen napkin before answering. People usually speak from pressure before they speak from character. Her coworker blinked in surprise. "You are not even upset." Emily glanced toward Ethan's table where discussions had already resumed. "Everyone carries something heavier than what we can see." Outside the rain intensified, tapping softly against the glass while headlights painted moving reflections across the dining room. Ethan continued leading the meeting with absolute confidence, questioning forecasts, challenging assumptions, and correcting minor calculation errors without hesitation. His reputation had been built on noticing what others missed. Across the room Emily quietly collected finished plates while her eyes drifted only once toward a financial worksheet resting beside Ethan's untouched coffee. She was too far away to read every line, yet one sequence of numbers lingered in her mind for reasons she could not explain. Something about the pattern felt strangely familiar. She looked away immediately and continued working. An hour later the meeting ended with satisfied handshakes and confident smiles. Ethan stood to leave, gathering the thick financial folders without realizing one summary page had slipped beneath the edge of the table. Emily noticed it only after the group disappeared through the revolving doors into the rainy Manhattan night. She bent down, picked up the single sheet, and paused for the briefest moment. Her calm blue eyes rested on one figure printed near the center of the page. Then she quietly whispered to herself, that number should not exist. Emily Carter stood alone beside the empty table while the rain continued tracing quiet lines across the glass walls of the Alder house. The folded financial summary rested lightly in her hand. She had every reason to place it inside the restaurant's lost and found envelope without looking at it again. Instead, her eyes returned to the same figure that had unsettled her only moments before. $500 million. It was not the size of the number that caught her attention. It was where the number appeared. A projected asset adjustment had been calculated after a valuation assumption instead of before it. The sequence looked clean. The formatting looked professional. The formulas probably balanced perfectly inside a spreadsheet. Yet the logic underneath felt wrong. Emily folded the page exactly as she had found it and walked toward the manager's office. "Mr. Lawson," she said softly, "one of the guests left this behind." The restaurant manager accepted the document without reading it. "That belongs to Mr. Brooks. I will have someone deliver it first thing tomorrow." Emily nodded. She almost turned away before quietly adding, "Please make sure it reaches him personally." Mr. Lawson smiled politely. "Do not worry. It will." Emily returned to the dining room where the last guests finished dessert beneath warm lights that reflected gently from polished wine glasses. Her shift ended just after 10 o'clock. She untied her black apron, folded it carefully into her canvas bag, and stepped outside into cool Manhattan air, still carrying the scent of rain and roasted coffee. Instead of taking the subway immediately, she walked 3 blocks to a small neighborhood cafe that stayed open until midnight. The elderly owner greeted her with a familiar smile. "Long day." Emily returned the smile. "Like every Tuesday." She ordered plain black coffee and sat beside the window overlooking wet sidewalks where umbrellas drifted beneath glowing streetlights. Her notebook rested inside her bag, worn from years of quiet observations. She opened to a blank page and drew only 3 simple lines representing the sequence she had seen on the financial summary. Then she wrote one sentence beneath them. "Assumption before valuation changes everything." She stared at the words for several seconds before closing the notebook again. Across town, Ethan Brooks entered the executive conference room on the top floor of Brooks Capital shortly before 11. The city stretched beneath the glass walls like a field of stars. Senior executives gathered around the table reviewing tomorrow's investor presentation. Ethan removed his jacket, loosened his tie slightly, and reached for the financial summary from dinner. His hand stopped. "Where is the revised valuation page?" Silence settled across the room. The chief financial officer looked through the folders once, then twice. "It should be here." Another executive checked every binder. Nothing. Ethan remained calm, but everyone recognized the stillness in his voice. "Find it before morning." Nobody argued. Meetings resumed while assistants searched conference rooms, elevators, and company vehicles. Midnight arrived without success. Back inside her apartment, Emily placed her notebook beside several books on economics, behavioral finance, and decision theory. Their worn covers suggested years of careful reading rather than decoration. She prepared chamomile tea, stood quietly beside the window, and watched rainwater slide across neighboring rooftops. Her phone buzzed with a message from a coworker asking whether Mr. Brooks had always been so demanding. Emily answered with only one sentence. "Pressure often reveals habits. It does not always reveal truth." She set the phone aside and turned off the lights. The following morning Brooks Capital awakened to controlled urgency. Employees moved quickly through bright hallways while assistants printed revised presentations and analysts checked every supporting document before the board meeting. Ethan accepted a fresh coffee from his executive assistant without noticing he had forgotten to drink it. At precisely 8:42, the chief financial officer entered carrying a replacement copy of the missing valuation report. Ethan opened the first page confidently. His expression changed almost immediately. He read the same paragraph twice before lifting his eyes toward the room. The assumption sequence still looked perfect. The formulas still balanced. Yet something about one single number refused to make sense. Somewhere across Manhattan, Emily tied on her apron, greeted the breakfast staff with her usual calm smile, and had no idea that the figure she could not forget had just become the first crack in a problem large enough to shake one of the most successful companies in America. By 9:15 that morning, the atmosphere inside Brooks Capital no longer resembled the calm confidence that had defined the company for years. Analysts hurried between conference rooms carrying updated reports while assistants printed revised projections that became outdated almost as quickly as they reached the table. Ethan Brooks stood before a 40-foot digital display showing charts, valuations, and investment models that had once appeared flawless. Now one number refused to behave like the others. Every adjustment created another imbalance somewhere else. The projected $500 million valuation increase looked mathematically consistent, yet every attempt to verify its underlying assumptions produced conflicting answers. Ethan folded his arms and studied the screen in complete silence. The chief financial officer cleared his throat. "We have reviewed the model 4 times. Ethan looked at him without raising his voice. "Then review the assumption before the model." The room fell quiet. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. They had spent hours testing formulas, not questioning the sequence that created them. Across the table a senior analyst cautiously replied, "The assumption follows the industry standard." Ethan answered immediately. "Standards are useful until they become invisible." The meeting continued for another 90 minutes without progress. Every expert defended a different explanation. One blamed market volatility. Another pointed toward delayed reporting from an overseas subsidiary. A third suggested an accounting software update might have introduced inconsistencies. None of the theories survived careful examination. The room grew heavier with every passing minute. Meanwhile, several miles away, Emily Carter carried 2 breakfast plates to a quiet corner booth inside the Alder house. Outside, sunlight reflected from sidewalks still damp after the previous night's rain. Inside, the familiar rhythm of coffee cups, quiet conversations, and polished silver created the comforting illusion that the world remained simple. Emily greeted regular customers by name, remembered exactly how one guest preferred oatmeal without cinnamon, and replaced another customer's cooling tea before he noticed it had lost its warmth. Yet beneath her calm routine, the number from the forgotten financial summary continued returning to her thoughts. $500 million. Not because it was enormous. Because it had never belonged where it appeared. During a brief break she retrieved her small notebook from her canvas bag and opened it beside the service station. On one page she sketched 4 simple boxes connected by arrows representing the order in which a valuation model should normally flow. On another page she reversed 2 of the arrows. Immediately the same uncomfortable feeling returned. A server glanced toward her notebook. Working on a puzzle? Emily smiled gently before closing it. Sometimes the smallest step changes the entire direction. Her coworker laughed politely without understanding what she meant. Back at Brooks Capital another emergency meeting had already begun. The board of directors joined remotely from offices across the country while legal advisors monitored the discussion from the back of the room. Investors expected answers before markets opened the following morning. Ethan listened carefully as each department presented new findings. Every report sounded intelligent. Every explanation sounded reasonable. None explained why projected company value increased before the underlying assets justified it. For the first time that day Ethan removed his platinum Swiss watch and placed it quietly on the conference table. Everyone in the room recognized the gesture. He did it only when absolute concentration mattered more than time itself. Forget the spreadsheets, he said calmly. Tell me the story these numbers are trying to tell. Silence answered him. Numbers had become calculations instead of narratives. Assumptions had become habits instead of questions. Hours later Ethan left headquarters without a solution. His driver steered the sedan through afternoon traffic while Manhattan moved past the tinted windows in blurred reflections of steel and glass. Almost without thinking he asked to stop at the Alder House for coffee before returning home. The restaurant manager welcomed him personally. Emily approached carrying a fresh pot with the same quiet professionalism as always. Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks. Ethan nodded absently, still studying printed reports spread across the table. As Emily placed the coffee beside him, her eyes briefly rested on the familiar valuation page lying near his untouched cup. She recognized the same sequence immediately. Then she noticed a handwritten correction added in blue ink. Instead of solving the problem, someone had unknowingly pushed the error even deeper into the model. Emily looked away at once and continued serving another table. Ethan never noticed her expression. He only stared at the same impossible figure that had refused to leave his mind since sunrise, completely unaware that the only person who truly understood where the mistake began had just quietly walked past his chair carrying nothing more remarkable than a pot of fresh coffee. The following morning began with bright autumn sunlight reflecting from the glass towers surrounding Brooks' Capital. But inside the executive headquarters, the atmosphere remained heavy with unanswered questions. Analysts filled every conference room, legal advisors reviewed documentation, and senior executives compared revised projections that somehow continued producing the same impossible result. The $500 million discrepancy refused to disappear. Every correction only moved the problem somewhere else. Ethan Brooks stood quietly at the end of the boardroom beneath a massive digital display showing hundreds of interconnected figures. His expression remained calm, but everyone around the table recognized the silence. It was the silence that appeared whenever he expected truth instead of excuses. Run the model again, he said. The chief financial officer nodded. We already have 6 times. Ethan slowly shook his head. You keep testing the calculation. I want someone to question the assumption. Nobody answered. Years of success had taught everyone how to defend a model. Very few remembered how to doubt one. Several miles away, Emily Carter arranged fresh flowers on the front tables inside the Alder House before the lunch crowd arrived. Soft jazz floated through the nearly empty restaurant while sunlight shimmered across polished crystal glasses. She folded clean linen napkins with the same careful precision she gave every task. Her manager approached carrying a sealed envelope. Emily, Mr. Brooks left this yesterday. He accidentally paid twice. Could you return the extra receipt if he comes back today? Emily accepted the envelope with a polite smile. Of course. She slipped it into the reservation drawer beside the hostess stand and returned to preparing the dining room. Her attention drifted briefly toward the financial sequence she had copied into her notebook the night before. She did not need to see the original report again. The pattern remained perfectly clear in her memory. A discounted cash flow assumption had been applied after a revised valuation adjustment instead of before it. The formulas themselves were accurate. The order was not. The mistake was invisible because every spreadsheet inherited the same flawed starting point. Shortly before noon, Ethan unexpectedly returned to the restaurant alone. His meeting with international investors had been postponed after the finance team requested another emergency review. He chose the same quiet corner table overlooking the rain-washed avenue outside. Emily approached carrying fresh coffee before he asked. Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks. Ethan acknowledged her with a tired nod that lacked the confidence he usually carried. Thank you. As she placed the cup beside him, she noticed another stack of printed reports resting unopened near his hand. He had not even looked at the menu. The restaurant manager soon arrived carrying the sealed envelope. Mr. Brooks, one of our servers noticed this belonged to you. Ethan accepted it absent-mindedly before opening the receipt. Nothing unusual appeared inside except the duplicate payment record. He thanked the manager politely and returned to studying the financial reports. Emily hesitated for the briefest moment. Every instinct told her to remain silent. It was not her place. She was a waitress. He was one of the most respected chief executive officers in the country. Yet another part of her understood that if nobody questioned the first assumption, hundreds of intelligent people could continue searching forever. She quietly placed the sugar bowl beside his untouched coffee. "Excuse me, Mr. Brooks." Ethan finally looked directly at her. "Yes." Emily chose her words carefully. "May I ask one question?" He appeared slightly surprised. "Go ahead." "Has anyone checked whether the first assumption was entered before the valuation adjustment instead of after it?" Ethan remained completely still. For several long seconds he simply looked at her without speaking. Around them the restaurant continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened. Coffee cups clinked softly against porcelain saucers. Rainwater dripped from umbrellas near the entrance. A child laughed quietly 2 tables away. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the report in front of him. Then he slowly turned to the page containing the same figure that had refused to make sense for nearly 2 days. Emily gently added one final sentence. "Sometimes the numbers are correct. Only their order is wrong." She offered a polite smile and stepped away before he could respond. Ethan watched her disappear into the rhythm of the dining room, serving another guest with the same quiet attention she had offered everyone else. He immediately reached for his phone and called the chief financial officer. "Cancel every meeting for the next hour," he said calmly. "I want the original assumption sequence on my screen before I speak to anyone else." Within 20 minutes the executive boardroom at Brooks Capital filled once again. Floor-to-ceiling displays illuminated the room with rows of financial models while analysts sat in complete silence waiting for Ethan Brooks to speak. He walked to the center of the table carrying nothing except the printed valuation report from the restaurant. He placed it beside a fresh cup of coffee that quickly began cooling untouched. "Open the original version," he said calmly. The chief financial officer nodded toward the technology team. Seconds later the earliest draft of the valuation model appeared on the largest screen. Every assumption. Every adjustment. Every formula. Exactly as it had first been created. Ethan folded his arms. "Do not calculate anything yet. Read the sequence." Confused expressions spread around the room. One analyst quietly began reading each line aloud. Revenue growth. Operating margin. Discount rate. Asset valuation adjustment. Terminal value. Another analyst interrupted. "That is the approved structure." Ethan shook his head. "No. Read what happened before that." Silence returned. The room had become so accustomed to trusting the spreadsheet that nobody questioned the order in which the assumptions entered the model. Ethan stepped closer to the screen. "Move the valuation adjustment beneath the original cash flow assumption." A programmer hesitated only briefly before changing the sequence. The formulas recalculated automatically. Numbers shifted across every display. Graphs refreshed. Projections stabilized. The impossible $500 million increase disappeared almost instantly. Nobody spoke. One executive slowly removed his glasses and stared at the screen as though seeing it for the first time. The chief financial officer whispered almost to himself. The formulas were never wrong. Ethan nodded. The story began in the wrong place. Another analyst carefully reviewed every linked worksheet. One by one each connected report corrected itself. Risk projections aligned. Debt ratios normalized. Long-term forecasts settled into realistic ranges. Nearly 2 days of confusion had been caused by a single assumption placed in the wrong order before dozens of perfectly accurate calculations inherited the same mistake. Ethan remained completely still while everyone else absorbed what had happened. He remembered the quiet waitress standing beside his table. Sometimes the numbers are correct. Only their order is wrong. Those words echoed louder now than every expert opinion he had heard since yesterday morning. The chief financial officer finally broke the silence. Who found this? Ethan looked toward the rain beginning once again beyond the conference room windows. Someone who never claimed to be the smartest person in the room. The meeting ended without celebration. Relief replaced panic, but Ethan felt something far more uncomfortable than either emotion. He replayed the previous evening inside the Alder house. Emily had quietly returned his document. She had never interrupted the meeting. She had accepted unfair criticism without defending herself. Then, when she finally spoke, she asked only one question instead of making one claim. That realization weighed heavier than the financial mistake itself. Late that afternoon Ethan returned to the restaurant carrying no reports and no assistants. Only a slim leather notebook rested beneath his arm. Emily was arranging polished silverware before the dinner guests arrived. She noticed him immediately and greeted him exactly as she greeted every customer. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Ethan stood quietly beside the table instead of sitting down. "I owe you an apology." Emily looked at him with calm curiosity. "For what?" "For assuming I already knew who you were." She smiled gently but did not answer immediately. Instead she placed a clean coffee cup on the table with the same steady hands that had served hundreds of guests over the years. "People usually introduce themselves through their actions," she said softly. "Names and titles come later." Ethan let the words settle between them. They carried no accusation. No satisfaction. Only quiet truth. Before he could continue, the restaurant manager hurried toward them carrying an excited expression. "Mr. Brooks, congratulations. The financial news just announced your company corrected the valuation before tomorrow's investor briefing. They are calling it remarkable leadership." Ethan accepted the compliment politely, but his eyes remained on Emily. He understood something the headlines never would. Leadership had not saved the company that afternoon. Humility had. Emily simply nodded, excused herself, and walked toward another table where an elderly couple had just arrived for an early anniversary dinner. She welcomed them with the same warm smile she had offered everyone else. Ethan watched her disappear into the rhythm of the restaurant, realizing that the person who had quietly protected a $500 million decision had done so without asking for recognition, payment, or even credit. For the first time in many years, the most valuable lesson he learned about business had not come from a boardroom. It had arrived carrying a pot of coffee and the patience to notice what everyone else had overlooked. The story spread through the financial district faster than anyone inside Brooks Capital expected. By the following morning, newspapers praised the company for correcting a critical valuation issue before it reached investors. Industry analysts called it an example of disciplined leadership. Television commentators credited Ethan Brooks for recognizing the problem in time. Nobody mentioned the quiet waitress who had asked a single question that changed everything. Emily Carter arrived at the Alder house before sunrise as she always did. She unlocked the side entrance with her manager, arranged fresh flowers on every table, polished the wine glasses until they reflected the first rays of morning light, and filled the coffee machines before the first customer stepped through the door. Nothing about her routine changed because the headlines had changed. Around 8:30, one of her coworkers rushed into the dining room holding a business newspaper. "Emily, have you seen this?" Emily looked up from arranging folded linen napkins. "Not yet." Her coworker pointed toward the front page featuring Ethan Brooks standing outside company headquarters. "They say he prevented a $500 million mistake overnight." Emily accepted the newspaper for only a moment before handing it back with a gentle smile. "I am glad everything worked out." Her coworker laughed softly. "You sound like you already knew." Emily returned to adjusting a centerpiece. Sometimes the best ending is simply knowing something bad did not happen. Across Manhattan, the atmosphere inside Brooks Capital felt completely different from only 24 hours earlier. Relief had replaced panic, but another conversation quietly began behind closed conference room doors. During the weekly executive review, the chief financial officer cleared his throat before speaking. "We still have one unanswered question." Ethan looked up from the meeting agenda. "Which one?" How did a restaurant server notice what an entire finance division overlooked? Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. One senior vice president spoke carefully. "Perhaps she saw the report after we corrected it." Another shook his head. "The correction happened after she mentioned the sequence." A third executive leaned forward. "With respect, there has to be another explanation." Ethan listened without interrupting. Finally he closed the folder in front of him. "Why?" The room became silent. He repeated the question more gently. "Why must there be another explanation?" Nobody answered immediately. Ethan continued, "If someone without a title notices something we missed, that does not make the observation less valuable. It only reminds us that intelligence does not ask permission before it appears." The discussion ended, but not everyone accepted his conclusion. Later that afternoon, the chief financial officer quietly instructed the internal compliance department to conduct a background review of Emily Carter. It was presented as a routine precaution, yet the decision carried a different purpose. Some people still refused to believe that quiet wisdom could exist without a hidden agenda. Meanwhile, Emily spent the afternoon serving lunch to tourists, attorneys, and office workers escaping the busy streets outside. An elderly professor visiting from Boston asked for recommendations on local museums. A young couple celebrated their engagement with sparkling cider because neither of them drank alcohol. Emily remembered both conversations long after the plates had been cleared. Near the end of her shift, the restaurant manager approached carrying a sealed envelope with the Brooks Capital logo embossed across the front. "This arrived by courier," he said. "It is addressed to you." Emily thanked him and opened it carefully. Inside rested a simple handwritten note instead of a formal letter. "Thank you for reminding me that confidence should never replace curiosity. I would appreciate the opportunity to buy you a cup of coffee whenever your schedule allows. Respectfully, Ethan Brooks." No business proposal appeared beneath the message. No reward. No contract. Only gratitude written in neat handwriting. Emily folded the note and slipped it inside her notebook beside the page where she had written that one quiet sentence 2 nights earlier. Assumption before valuation changes everything. She looked through the restaurant window as light rain began falling once more across the city. The streets filled with umbrellas, headlights shimmered across wet pavement, and strangers hurried past without noticing one another. Emily quietly whispered to herself, "Sometimes the hardest thing to change is not a number. It is the way people decide who is worth listening to." She placed the notebook back into her canvas bag and returned to greet a new family entering the restaurant with the same calm smile she had offered every guest before them, unaware that somewhere inside Brooks Capital, one person's quiet appreciation had already begun colliding with another person's growing suspicion, and that the next chapter would test not only the truth she carried but also the character of everyone who believed. They already understood it. 3 days later the rain gave way to clear blue skies, but inside Brooks Capital the atmosphere carried a different kind of uncertainty. The internal compliance report on Emily Carter had finally arrived. The chief financial officer placed the sealed folder on the conference table before the morning executive meeting began. Several executives expected to discover a hidden career, an undisclosed consulting firm, or evidence that she had somehow gained unauthorized access to confidential financial information. Instead, the report contained something far less dramatic. Emily Carter had never worked for an investment bank. She had never been employed by a hedge fund. She had never served as a corporate consultant. Her employment history listed family restaurants, neighborhood cafes, and eventually the Alder House. There were no disciplinary actions, no legal disputes, and no unexplained financial records. One page, however, attracted everyone's attention. It showed that nearly 10 years earlier she had earned a master's degree in economics with highest honors from Columbia University. Another page revealed that she had completed advanced research in financial modeling before unexpectedly withdrawing from a doctoral fellowship. The report ended with a brief note from a former professor. Emily Carter possesses extraordinary analytical judgment. She consistently questioned assumptions others accepted without examination. Ethan Brooks quietly closed the folder. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, the chief financial officer broke the silence. Why would someone with these credentials become a waitress? Ethan looked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. Perhaps because life asks different questions than careers do. The answer satisfied no one except him. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at the Alder house carrying only the handwritten invitation he had sent earlier in the week. Emily greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered every guest. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Ethan smiled politely. "I was hoping you might have 10 minutes after your shift." "Only if it is convenient." Emily considered the request for a moment before nodding. "I finish at 4:30. Then I will be waiting." The afternoon passed quietly. Emily served business lunches, recommended desserts, and helped a young father calm his nervous daughter before her first piano recital by placing an extra cookie beside her hot chocolate. Small acts of kindness continued flowing naturally from her without expectation of recognition. At exactly 4:30 she removed her apron, folded it carefully inside her canvas bag, and stepped outside where Ethan stood beside a small corner cafe across the street instead of an expensive private club. He had chosen an ordinary place on purpose. They sat beside the front window while soft sunlight reflected across passing traffic. Ethan stirred his coffee before speaking. "May I ask you something personal?" Emily nodded gently. "You may ask. Why did you leave economics?" Emily looked out the window for several quiet seconds. "My father became ill during my doctoral program. My mother had already passed away several years earlier. Someone needed to care for him." Ethan listened without interrupting. "After he recovered, I realized I had changed. I still loved economics, but I no longer wanted my work to revolve around proving I was the smartest person in the room. I wanted a life where people mattered before numbers did." Ethan slowly lowered his cup onto the table. "Do you ever regret that decision?" Emily smiled softly. "Not once." Before either could continue, Ethan's phone vibrated. A message from the chief financial officer appeared across the screen. "Another valuation inconsistency has been discovered inside a recently acquired subsidiary. We need to discuss immediately." Ethan frowned slightly before looking back toward Emily. "Business never seems to wait." Emily noticed the concern in his expression. "Perhaps this time your team will begin by questioning the first assumption." Ethan laughed quietly for the first time in days. "I believe they finally learned that lesson." They stood and walked toward the sidewalk together. As they reached the corner, neither of them noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. Inside, the chief financial officer watched through the windshield with growing unease. The background investigation had failed to reveal deception. The conversation he had quietly witnessed revealed something even more unsettling. Emily Carter had never tried to influence Ethan Brooks. She had simply earned his respect. And for a man who had spent years protecting his position inside the company, the quiet trust growing between a billionaire chief executive officer and a humble waitress suddenly felt far more dangerous than any financial mistake ever could. The following Monday began with steady rain falling across Manhattan once again, turning every avenue into a ribbon of shimmering reflections beneath gray skies. Brooks Capital gathered its executive leadership inside the main boardroom to review the newly discovered inconsistency involving the recently acquired subsidiary. Ethan Brooks entered carrying only a legal pad instead of the usual stack of polished reports. The change did not go unnoticed. Around the table sat department heads, senior analysts, legal advisors, and the chief financial officer, whose composed expression concealed growing uneasiness. Ethan looked around the room before speaking. Before anyone presents conclusions, I want us to begin differently today. Curious faces lifted toward him. Question the first assumption before defending the final answer. No one objected. Instead, analysts reopened the original acquisition documents rather than the revised summaries. For nearly an hour the room remained unusually quiet as every department retraced the earliest decisions instead of reviewing polished presentations. Gradually a pattern emerged. Several projections inherited the same outdated market assumption that had never been updated after the acquisition closed. The calculations themselves were accurate. The starting point had quietly remained frozen in the past. Ethan watched the realization spread across the room. Nobody had hidden the mistake. Everyone had unknowingly trusted yesterday's certainty more than today's evidence. The meeting ended with clear solutions instead of blame. Yet one person appeared increasingly uncomfortable. The chief financial officer lingered behind after everyone else departed. You have changed the way this company makes decisions, he said carefully. Ethan looked toward the rain sliding across the boardroom windows. No. Someone reminded me how decisions should always have been made. The chief financial officer hesitated before asking the question that had troubled him for days. Do you truly trust someone you barely know? Ethan answered without hesitation. I trust character when I see it. Across town, Emily Carter welcomed guests into the Alder house as another busy lunch service began. The familiar rhythm of coffee, conversation, polished silver, and warm bread continued unchanged. A young investment analyst sat alone near the window reading an article about Brooks Capital's renewed commitment to stronger internal review procedures. He smiled while folding the newspaper. It is refreshing to see a company admit it can improve. Emily poured fresh coffee into his cup. The strongest people usually keep learning. The customer thanked her without realizing how deeply those words reflected her own life. Later that afternoon Ethan arrived unexpectedly. This time he was accompanied by several senior executives who had insisted on meeting the woman whose quiet observation had changed the direction of the company. The restaurant manager welcomed them with visible excitement while nearby diners glanced curiously toward the distinguished group. Emily approached carrying water glasses with the same calm professionalism she always displayed. Ethan stood before she reached the table. The executives instinctively followed his example. The dining room gradually became quieter as guests noticed one of the country's most respected chief executive officers remaining on his feet while a waitress served water. Ethan waited until Emily finished placing every glass before speaking. There is something I should have done the first day we met. Emily looked at him with gentle curiosity. Ethan's voice remained calm but carried through the room with unmistakable sincerity. I judged your position before I recognized your wisdom. I confused a uniform with a limitation. I was wrong. No one moved. Even the soft piano music seemed to disappear beneath the silence. Emily smiled with quiet warmth. We all see more clearly after we choose to look. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed a sealed envelope on the table. This is not a reward. Emily opened it slowly. Inside was an invitation to join Brooks Capital as an independent advisor for leadership development and critical thinking workshops, allowing her complete freedom to accept or decline without changing her own career unless she wished to. She read the letter carefully before folding it closed. Thank you, she said sincerely. May I think about it? Ethan smiled. That is exactly the answer I hoped you would give. As the executives quietly returned to their seats, several restaurant employees exchanged astonished glances. They had expected applause, celebration, perhaps even headlines. Instead they witnessed something far more meaningful. Respect had entered the room without demanding attention. Emily returned to serving lunch exactly as she had only moments before, greeting every customer with the same patience and kindness. Ethan watched her move gracefully through the dining room and finally understood that genuine greatness never announced itself. It simply kept showing up every day, doing ordinary things with extraordinary character, until even the most powerful people had no choice but to recognize what had been standing quietly in front of them all along. Several weeks passed, and autumn settled gently across Manhattan. Golden leaves gathered along quiet sidewalks while morning sunlight reflected from glass towers with the same steady rhythm that had always greeted another business day. Inside Brooks Capital, something subtle had changed. Meetings began differently. Analysts no longer rushed to defend the first answer they found. Junior employees were encouraged to question assumptions before presenting conclusions. Whiteboards filled with handwritten questions before spreadsheets appeared on large screens. Ethan Brooks had introduced one simple principle into every leadership meeting. Begin with curiosity before certainty. At first, some executives considered it an unnecessary exercise. Within a month, productivity improved, overlooked risks declined, and conversations became noticeably more thoughtful. Investors praised the company's discipline, but those inside the organization understood that the greatest improvement had never appeared on a balance sheet. It had appeared in the way people listened to one another. Across the city, life inside the Alder house continued almost exactly as before. Emily Carter still arrived before the first customer, still arranged fresh flowers on every table, still remembered birthdays, favorite coffees, and quiet details that made strangers feel unexpectedly welcome. The invitation from Brooks Capital remained carefully folded inside her notebook. After thoughtful consideration, she had accepted Ethan's proposal on one condition. She would continue working part-time at the restaurant because it reminded her why numbers mattered in the first place. Ethan accepted immediately. Once each month she visited Brooks Capital for a single afternoon, not to build financial models or approve investments, but to lead conversations about observation, humility, critical thinking, and the hidden cost of unquestioned assumptions. She never stood behind a podium. She preferred sitting around the conference table with a notebook and a cup of coffee, asking simple questions that often proved more valuable than complicated answers. During one session, a young analyst admitted, "I used to believe experience meant always being right." Emily smiled gently. Experience often means becoming comfortable saying, "Let us look again." The room fell thoughtfully quiet. Ethan watched from the back without interrupting. He had learned that the strongest lessons rarely arrived with applause. One rainy evening he returned alone to the Alder house after another successful quarter. The restaurant looked exactly as it had the night they first met. Warm chandeliers reflected across polished marble. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Rain traced familiar silver lines down the windows while fresh coffee filled the air with its comforting aroma. Emily approached carrying a porcelain cup before he spoke a single word. "Your usual dark roast," she said with the same calm smile. Ethan laughed softly. "You still remember." Emily placed the cup before him. "People remember what matters to them." He looked around the dining room where families celebrated birthdays, business partners discussed new ideas, and elderly couples quietly shared dessert. Nothing about the room suggested extraordinary events had ever unfolded there. That somehow made the memory even more meaningful. Ethan removed a small folded note from his jacket and placed it beneath the saucer. "I thought this belonged here." After he left, Emily unfolded the paper. It contained only one sentence written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for teaching me that wisdom does not announce itself, it simply pays attention." She smiled quietly, folded the note beside the first one he had ever written, and slipped both into her notebook before greeting another family entering from the rain. Outside, the city continued moving with its usual urgency. Inside, coffee continued warming cold hands, conversations continued changing lives, and ordinary moments quietly carried extraordinary meaning. Many years later, business schools would study Brooks Capital as a company transformed by better leadership, stronger judgment, and a culture built on intellectual humility. Very few people would ever know that the turning point began not inside a boardroom but beside a restaurant table where a waitress politely asked whether anyone had questioned the first assumption. Perhaps that was exactly how the story was always meant to end, because titles may open doors and wealth may command attention, but character quietly changes people long after applause has faded. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.